The Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 6th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up. And from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Bread. It is a simple food, yet has been for centuries and remains a staple of people's diets. While for our society it is, and I'm speaking from personal experience, the cause of many an expanding waistline, bread has also been the source of life for many people. Having bread meant living another day. Bread is also an important symbol for the church and for our life of faith. And so this morning we enter into what preachers like to call the season of bread. We begin today a 5-week study of John chapter 6. Did you catch that? 5 weeks, 1 chapter of the Bible, which is an indication that this is a pretty important chapter for the church. We start with today's gospel lesson, Jesus feeding a great multitude. And over the course of the next several weeks, we will delve deep into Jesus' use of bread as a metaphor for his ministry, his death, and resurrection. We will be challenged to see within this chapter rich contours of hope, our calling to trust God, and an invitation to discover the deeper hungers that God alone is able to satisfy. And ultimately, we will come to know Jesus as the bread of life, who gives himself for us and for the world. So let's dive in. John begins by setting the scene. Jesus and his disciples have crossed the Sea of Galilee to a more or less deserted spot. They are up on the mountainside, perhaps for some private teaching. But they are not alone for long because a large crowd gathers around them. This crowd has seen Jesus healing people, and they are wanting more. And as they're coming up to them and they see this crowd approaching, Jesus leans to Philip and says, "Where are we to buy bread for all these people to eat?" And thus begins the only miracle story of Jesus that appears in all 4 Gospels. Each Gospel tells it a little bit differently, and John has the most variations in his details, but those details are really important. Take one that appears in verse 4, for example. John tells us that the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. The Passover, so this miracle that's about to happen is taking place right at the time of Passover. Well, what do we remember about the events of Passover? We remember Moses and the burning bush and his call to go to Egypt and set his people free, and Moses challenging Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And the 10 plagues that afflicted Egypt because of Pharaoh's stubbornness, and the last one was the angel of death coming, but passing over those homes that had blood of a lamb on the lintel. Remember the story? Is it all coming back to you? And so they escape from Egypt. They are delivered through the Red Sea. They wander for 40 years, sustained by manna, the bread from heaven. And the central point of this story is that it is God who delivered and sustained the people of Israel on their way from slavery into freedom. One of the questions that the Exodus story asks is whether or not God is able. Is God sufficient? And the people of Israel learn, yes, God is sufficient. God is able. So the story that we're hearing today is set within that context of Passover, of remembering that event. And that story of Exodus and Passover permeates the whole of John chapter 6. So we're going to want to remember the story of Exodus as we go through these weeks of John 6. It's never far from what Jesus is saying or doing. Nor is this question about the sufficiency of God that also permeates this whole chapter. God's ability to provide for us and through us, even when it seems that there is too little to go around. And so enter in another of John's little details, a certain young boy who offers to share with Jesus what's in his lunchbox. On the face of it, it's totally absurd. 5 little loaves of barley bread and 2 dried fish. There are thousands of people in the crowd. But in the hands of Jesus, it suddenly becomes not just enough, but more than enough. John doesn't say that everybody got a few measly crumbs. No, everyone got as much as they wanted. They were satisfied, and then there were leftovers. So while all of the adults were stressed out over what they don't have, over what isn't in the bank account, or the ministry budget, or the impossibility of the situation, a child boldly offers up what he has, somehow believing that with Jesus, it will make a difference. And it does. Offered up this boy's little bit becomes more than just a meal for thousands. It becomes a sign, a pointer to the reality of the living God, the God of the Exodus, at work in the world in and through Jesus. And I believe that God can and will do the same for us as we are willing to trust God with what we have and with who we are, as little as that might seem sometimes. The churchy word for this is stewardship. Stewardship begins with the acknowledgement that everything we have is a gift from God. That it is God who provides for us, who meets our needs, who satisfies our hunger, even our abilities, our skills and abilities that make it possible for us to earn a living. These are gifts from God to us, gifts that God would have us offer up for the sake of the world's need. So, for example, when we place our money in the offering plate or give electronically, as many do, we aren't just giving to an institution or paying the bills. We don't give to keep the lights on. Our gifts become signs of God's kingdom. Have you ever considered that your financial gifts are signs of God's kingdom? They are signs of God's kingdom because, one, it is an acknowledgement of trust that God will provide, that I can do without this and still have plenty to live on, that I can share what God has given me to benefit others and still have plenty to eat and a roof over my head, and I will be cared for. So it's a sign of trust in God's provision. And secondly, it's a sign to the world of God's healing and salvation. When we support the work of justice and peace, when we give to world hunger, when we offer help through Lutheran disaster response, or we support the work of missionaries or places like the Faraja School, we become signs of hope and of God's love for those who receive the care. And it's not just the wide-ranging global stuff. It's also right here and now. When we offer our time and support to our lunch ministry or to Ghent area ministries, we become signs of God's presence in Norfolk. When we shelter the homeless through Nest, when we help a family through Laundry Love, or visit a shut-in, or donate to the food bank, or volunteer in our communities, Jesus takes what we give, as little as it may seem, and multiplies it in the lives of others. When we gather in this place, the community of faith, as we have for nearly 125 years, we serve as a sign of God's presence, pointing beyond ourselves to the love and grace of God in every person who hears a word of forgiveness, in every new believer who is baptized, in every couple who is married, in every saint who is laid to rest. Jesus is proclaimed and experienced and is among us. For this is where he is promised to be, in word, in water, in wine, in the gathered faithful. In short, in and through us and all that we offer to God, God works miracles and signs each and every day, which I think is one of the challenges for us in our gospel. The challenge of putting ourselves not in the place of those who, like the crowds, are merely fed by the bread that Jesus offers, but rather in the place of the young boy who in faith offered the bread to begin with. We are taught to live with a worldview of scarcity. Almost every marketing campaign and advertisement we experience teaches us to focus on what we don't have. We are shaped by messages of not enough. And indeed, as we look at all the situations, at all the brokenness, at all the pain that is present in our world today, it is easy to feel as if there's nothing that we can really do. Sometimes you may just want to say to God, when are you going to do something about all of this? To which God replies, I have. I made you. Now go out and get busy. Not to say that we have to go out somehow and save the world ourselves. The point is that God calls us to use what we have been given, as little as that may seem sometimes, and to use who we are, as flawed and broken as we so often are, to use who he has created us to be, living signs that point to God's love and salvation. What the world needs now is people with a passionate trust in God, to give our lives for Jesus, to open up our lunch boxes, to open up the first fruits of our time, our talents, and our treasures, and give them to Jesus so that he might take and bless them, and through them, and through us, bless the world. Amen.